To put some sort of context around this month's blog article on non-centralized security, or how to get to centralized security, I want to start by just briefly talking about Windows security. Now, as you can see here, I am logged on to this computer. In fact, there we go, a little Control-Alt-Delete, and you can see that I get the standard screen, so I'm clearly logged on as someone. I can change my password and everything else. Having logged on like that, Windows has created for me a security token that represents my user account. It contains the GUIDs, or SIDs, globally unique identifiers, but they're called security identifiers when they're used for security. That token contains all of the SIDs, both from my user account and the user account, or the every group account, I guess, that I belong to. So my user account, all my groups. Anytime I go to contact a server to get, let's say, a file, that server has to determine if I'm allowed to have access to that file. And the way it does that, we can just jump in here and take a look at any random folder like Windows. Take a look at the properties. And on the sharing or security tab, you'll see the users and the groups that have access to this. Now, generally speaking, what these access control lists, or ACLs like this, contain is a bunch of SIDs, or security identifiers. Now, we as humans have no use for that information, so when this dialog is built, it actually goes to the security authority and gets the name that's associated with each one. In the case of local accounts, that happens pretty quickly, but when you've been looking at one of these in Windows and you see a really large one, I'm sure you've seen the little question mark over here, and you might have even seen a SID listed here instead of the name, while the dialog box goes out to a domain controller or global catalog server and translates those SIDs into the names that you see here. So this is what an access control list consists of: a list of SIDs that have permissions and what permissions they have. So I click on Administrator and I can see that there are no explicit conditions other than these special ones applied. If I wanted to edit this or something else, then I would be able to get in and change those things. So each access control list consists of access principals, or security principals, that's groups and users. Each one of those access control entries, or ACEs, also has a grant or deny, along with one or more permissions, like grant read, grant write, and so forth. So the actual permissions, the authorization that allows me to access a file, is stored with the file or the folder, or its parent. The point being, it's stored on a file server. Same thing in Exchange or SharePoint. All the permissions are stored at the point where they're used, even though those permissions might be applied to one or more principals drawn from Active Directory. And that's what all of these users and groups are. So when I talk about the need for centralized security, I'm not talking about centralized authentication. Authentication being the process of proving that you are, in fact, administrator, or you are, in fact, Don Jones, or guest, or any of these other security principles. We do have centralized authentication through Active Directory. What we don't have is centralized authorization. In other words, it's very easy for me to go to a particular log and see when Don Jones has logged onto the system. It's very difficult for me to find out what files that person has accessed, or what files they even have permission to access, simply because all of that information is stored in so many separate places. I essentially have to inventory every single possible resource to see who has permissions on all of it. Well, that makes doing any kind of security auditing or reporting extremely difficult. For example, it's easy enough for me to go into Server Manager here on a file server, and I can go into, let's see, Diagnostics. We'll hop into the Event Viewer, look at the Windows security log, and this log will show me all of the security information that I could possibly want to look at, but it's just for this server. So if I wanted to see file accesses on another server, I'd have to go to that other server. Even on this single server, if I wanted to see everything that you had permission to, I would need to walk through a lot of dialog boxes. Now, there are some command line ways to help that out. For example, here in Windows PowerShell, there's a get ACL commandlet. And if we give it a path, it'll tell us the entire access control list for that path. So if I say get ACL just on C, you can see that these are the permissions that have been assigned to that. If I look at C Windows, you can see which permissions have been assigned to that one as well. The majority of the permissions on a file server, of course, start at that top level root directory and then inherit downward unless you change it. You'll notice that there's no recurs here. It's certainly possible for me to get a bunch of paths, pipe it to this commandlet, and then see what sort of permissions come up, but it would take an awful long time to watch that run through. In fact, let's take a look at a sort of do-it-yourself tool for reporting on all the permissions of all the resources on this server. I'll start with dir. I'll ask it to recurse, and of course you could start maybe in a different folder, but we'll start at the top level, and I'll pipe those paths to get ACL. And here we go. And yeah, this is definitely going to take a while. I could pump this out to a CSV file or perhaps an XML file, but ultimately searching through here is going to be awfully time consuming. And it is largely because of the extremely distributed nature of these permissions. I mean, not only are we talking about permissions being distributed across many different servers, but even within a server, the permissions are individually distributed down to the individual resource. There's just no centralization for the authorization process. And that's what makes managing and auditing and enforcing the right permissions for the right people on the right resources extremely difficult. And it's the topic of this month's blog article.